Hi, I'm Mitch Gallagher. Welcome to the Sweetwater Minute. This time out, we are joined by Geoff Daking from Daking Electronics.
And here we are.
Here we are. Glad to see you.
Nice to see you.
Thanks for coming in. We appreciate you being here.
Always like coming to Fort Wayne.
Absolutely. A pleasure to have you here. You've been on the Sweetwater Minute before.
I have.
We forced you.
It was years ago, I think.
I think it's been a while, yeah. Well, let's catch up.
Okay.
So what's been happening?
Well, you know, since then we've come out with this whole range of 500 modules.
Right.
Which are the mic pre, compressor, and the 4-band EQ. And we also sell that as a package pre-formatted in a pretty much the rack of your choice, but I think we ship them in API racks.
Right.
And we ship it with a loop-through cable that goes 135, 246, so that you only have to go in stereo and out stereo. You don't have to have that big jumble of cables on the back.
Right. So it's kind of configured as a stereo channel strip.
Correct. Well, obviously you have the XLRs in the back to do whatever you want, but it's I think that's the way that it would be used the most, and so
right.
You know, it's very portable. You walk around with your little rack, you have 2 mics or whatever. And
right, you're ready to go.
there you go.
Right. So as a gear designer, what are the challenges you face in taking your full-size EQ, preamp, compressor, and getting them into that 500 series format?
A lot of people have the misconception that the 500 series format is low voltage, which it isn't. It's 30 volts my stuff runs on 48 volts regulated down to 43. But in the API rack, you have bipolar 15 or bipolar 16. So you have 30 or 32 volts.
Okay.
We just use it differently. We don't use it as bipolar 15. We use it as 30 and 0.
Okay.
So that's a little bit of a challenge. But the people who think that the API rack is underpowered would be surprised to find out that Neve consoles run on 24 volts.
Right.
So it's not underpowered at all. The only challenge we have is that because our stuff is single-ended, 0 and 40, then we have to make it work on the bipolar rails. But other than that, there's no problem.
Right.
It works fine.
Great, great. Any major challenges as far as just fitting that size format?
Well, you have to use smaller components. You have to use smaller pots and switches and things that smaller than you might normally.
Sure, right. But you can pretty much transfer directly, and it's, as far as you're concerned, the sound quality and things are identical when you go from one format to the other?
I think so. And one of the things that we do in the 500 series is we don't use the output transformers. We use differential outputs,
Okay.
which in a funny sort of way work out better because they have better low frequency performance. Because transformers eventually fall off somewhere, 25 hertz or 20 hertz, and the differential amplifiers will go right as low as we can measure it. They're flat.
Right.
And we don't in our gear, unlike some other people's stuff, we don't create any vibe in the output transformer. We use a Jensen where we do use transformers. We use Jensen transformers, and they're only at 1 to 2, so you're not getting any vibe out of that transformer anyway. So for us, it's not a compromise to go to a differential amplifier.
Very interesting. Yeah, I think that would be more of a challenge if you were really pushing that, getting that transformer saturation and thing out of there, trying to recreate that.
Well, if you're like an API or Neve, where a tremendous amount of the sound comes from the output transformer, that would be a problem.
Right.
But we get our sound earlier. We're not depending on the output transformer for that.
Right. So when you're going back even to when you were just beginning to design the gear, how did you come up with that approach? What was the sound that you were going for? Were you trying to recreate a vintage sound? Were you going for a more transparent sound, or what was your whole philosophy?
I started making this gear in the early 90s when people were just transitioning into home studios. MIDI was really, so I had a lot of songwriters and producers that were customers in my studio who wanted to build studios. And at the time, you could buy an API preamp and you could buy believe it or not, back in 1990, there were maybe only 2 or 3 external mic preamps that you could buy.
Yeah, right.
Neve wouldn't sell you one. And so sitting around with a bunch of engineers, we said, well, what's the best sounding console you ever worked on? And they all said the Trident A range, which of course nobody remembers any longer because there were only 13 of them anyway, and you probably couldn't find anybody who ever worked on one nowadays. But
right.
So I called up Trident. I called Phil Wagner at the time, was the president of Trident USA. And I said, why don't you make these modules again? People really like them. He said, Trident has no interest in doing it. We want to make all this computerized stuff. He said, why don't you do it? So they sold me the schematic.
Mm-hmm.
I borrowed a module from Lenny Kravitz, who had an A-range console, and we just recreated that circuit.
Okay.
It's a very simple circuit that has its own incredible vibe.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So that's where most of the stuff comes from.
Oh, very interesting. Very interesting. So speaking of consoles, you're here right before the AES show, and you were just telling us kind of a sneak preview of what you're going to be showing at the, or talking about at the show.
Well, we've made consoles over the years. We've never made a lot. We probably made about 24 consoles, large format, mostly 32 input consoles. But now we're going to make a console which is very similar in size to an API 1608. It's a console, 16 inputs, 8 buses, stereo bus, stereo aux, 4 auxes, a very comprehensive center section and monitoring, full returns that return to all the same buses as the inputs.
Okay.
In a compact package. And the other thing that we're doing, some acoustic designers came to me and said, we want consoles to be acoustically balanced mechanically. And we want to be able to have the computer in the center of the console so that the guy doesn't have to be working like this all the time.
Right.
And the only other 2 consoles that are really comparable to mine are the Neve and the API, and their center sections are integrated to the main frame, so you can't do this. Mine, you can separate it. So at AES, we'll be showing it with 16 modules on the left, a center section for the computer, and the returns and patch bay on the right.
Okay.
So it's acoustically, mechanically balanced with the computer dead center.
Very nice. Very nice. So you don't have to leave the sweet spot when you're sitting and you're editing and you're
exactly.
mixing, and everything is accessible there.
Exactly.
Now, is the console expandable? Can you add more channels to that? Is 16 where you're setting that up?
In buckets of 16.
Okay, so you
Or
can.
short-loaded buckets of 16.
Okay, great, great. It's been interesting to watch the move in studios back toward consoles and some of those kind of things. What's your take on that whole side of the gear evolution, if you will?
Well, personally, I think that having been a recording engineer for a long time, I only want to record on a console. I don't like this concept of, oh, I'll have 2 of this and 2 of that, and that's what I call audio schizophrenia.
Okay.
Do you want to go halfway around a drum set and change mic pre's? No, I don't think so. It's much easier. You know, my motto in making gear, you notice that in my gear, I don't put on a lot of bells and whistles. I don't put on all these little silly, tricky things that people want. My motto is get home early. Right. And so I want to sit down in front of a console where everything sounds the same. If it's an API or a Neve or one of mine, everything in front of you is the same. And it makes it much easier. The whole schizophrenia flavor thing came after the 90s when you could buy all this other stuff.
Right.
And so I think, you know, when you consider that for $60,000, let's say, you're going to get 16 mic pre's, 16 EQs, 16 compressors, meters, summing, monitoring control, returns. You know, it's actually a console is actually a bargain.
Right.
If you're actually ever going to require that many inputs.
Right, right. And if you think back to the classic recordings that certainly I came up with and that we all kind of based our work on, they were all done on consoles.
Yes.
So you had the console and those were the preamps that you had available to you, and that was the EQ. Maybe you had a little bit of outboard gear, but it really is interesting to see it come back full circle to that.
Yeah, well, if you're going to do ensemble recording of any sort, you need to have at least 16 inputs.
Sure.
The very first studio I ever worked in as an engineer, we had API number 1, and it had 16 inputs and no returns. It was very interesting.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah.
No doubt. But enough to get the job done, right?
Made a lot of records on that console.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and then the next one we had 20 inputs.
Wow.
And then we moved to 24 inputs. You know. But you can make good records with 16 inputs.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Geoff, thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely our pleasure to have you here. We're excited about the new console. Lots of cool stuff happening.
There you go.
So please come back and visit us again.
Oh, I'll be back.
Absolutely. We look forward to it.
Unless I offend someone.
Well, I appreciate it also that we have a matching clothing ensemble.
We do, but you do have to call me in the morning.
All right. All right. I'm Mitch Gallagher. Thanks for joining me for the Sweetwater Minute.
Thanks for having us.